Welcome to the Jobs and Work podcast. If you're like most Americans, you spend a significant amount of your time working. In fact, we spend more time at our jobs than anywhere else. But how often do we really talk about work in America? On this podcast, the Work for Change team will. Work for Change, LLC is a team of social scientists, thought leaders, and digital storytellers who dig into the critical issues affecting American workers and workplaces today. Our podcast is co-hosted by Dr. Kendra Jason and myself, Dr. Kris Maycumber. We'll also bring guests onto the show who reflect the diversity of the American workforce. We are so excited for you to join us as we lead the efforts to humanize the workplace by building dignity and equity into jobs, work, and organizations. Please subscribe to the podcast and share us with your friends and family. You can learn more about Work for Change at workforchangellc.com. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Jobs and Work podcast, where we talk about all things related to jobs and work today. This is episode number 19, and the theme today is Conversations with Kendra and Kris, and I'm your co-host, Kris Maycumber.
And I'm co-host Kendra Jason. And today, what I really want to dive into is workplace violence. And so this is not an in the news segment. We do in the news once a month, but we would be remiss without talking about workplace violence, especially after the San Jose shootings that just happened on yesterday, which was yet another, tragic workplace mass shooting. And so one of the expertise that Kris has in particular, is really talking about workplace violence and what does it look like and how can workplaces better respond to it so that all workers, employees are safer. I mean, we want to feel safe at work, right? It's just like we want to feel safe at home, but you have workplace violence, and how we want to think about workplace violence is beyond mass shootings. It's really interesting that we've had so many mass shootings in American history, but in more recently, that we only think about workplace violence and we think about a single gunman coming in with a high-powered rifle, which is a scary enough image. But what is also scary is when you're, let's just say, working in your cubicle and working behind a desk and you're talking to your favorite coworker and she turns white, right? And she's paralyzed and you're like, what's wrong? And she says, I see my boyfriend coming across the room. Her boyfriend doesn't work there. They had a fight last night, right? And so that is another instance of workplace violence. And so Kris and I just wanted to take some time to talk about what workplace violence looks like and what we can better do to prepare workers and prepare the workplace so we won't have such horrific outcomes. So just a little bit of background, there are 4 major types of workplace violence. Type 1 that they call criminal intent, and this is where the perpetrator has no relationship with the workplace or the workers. You can think about this as an example, someone committing a robbery for it, they don't work there, they don't have a relationship. And they end up, the robbery in itself is a violent act, but if they end up shooting or hurting or, some clients or customers or workers, that's an example. The second type is customer and client. What comes to mind in this world of social media is, fast food videos where you see, irate customers get upset because their order is wrong and they have altercations with fast food workers. It could be a fight, it can be a scuffle, and as we've seen, some customers come back with weapons and cause harm or fatalities due to a dispute. Another type is worker on worker. What makes me think of this is even in my personal history, not me fighting myself, but years and years and years ago, I worked in a call center. And I remember that there were workers who would have fights on the floor, and sometimes after work, people would have fights outside. And it wasn't like a melee every week or even a dangerous workplace, but just in my memory, this was a place where, more than once I saw, workers engage in physical altercations. Luckily, there were no fatalities and no weapons involved. And then finally is personal relationship. And that was the example that I started out with. And again, what comes to memory, again, years and years ago, I was working with a coworker. She was a good coworker friend of mine. And we were just in conversation, and she literally froze just in the conversation, and she ran out the room. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what happened? And then she said, my boyfriend's here. And she was, and what I remember about that, of course, is her, how scared she was, but then how scared I was, because we didn't know what to do as a workplace or as workers when someone came in to cause physical threat. And especially there was like this weird line between domestic violence coming into the workplace as workplace violence. And I didn't really know how to wrap my head around that at the time. I believe I was around 20 years old. So I just wanted to start out there. I'm going to turn it over to Kris so she can offer us some more insight on workplace violence.
Thanks, Kendra, for that framing. And I think, laying out those 4 key types gives our audience a sort of vision of how it plays out, where it plays out, and the kind of relationships that precede violence. And certainly, I think what we hear most about is the, mass shootings happening in a workplace, right? Where someone comes in, a perpetrator is either a former employee who's a disgruntled employee, or is just committing some sort of random act of violence. And oftentimes, a lot of those mass shootings also have histories of domestic violence. So when we're, talking about workplace violence, there is often that thread where if somebody's violent in one context, they tend to have a history of other forms of violence. And you hit upon, a lot of key trends that are actually like trending on an increase. 1 out of 7 people today report that they don't feel safe at work.
Yeah.
And that's across those 4 different types: afraid of a mass shooting, afraid of an intimate partner violence situation coming into the workplace, and afraid of their interactions. Particularly healthcare workers and retail get a lot of the customer worker violations. Healthcare, understandably, there's a physical intimacy, a bodily touching that like has to happen by the virtue of the job oftentimes, which in other jobs you're not allowed to touch people who you work with, who are your customers and clients. So there's a lot of different dynamics at play here. And we know that also, not only do 1 out of 7 people feel unsafe at work, but in all of those 4 types that you just laid out, they're all on the rise. Like all of those forms of violence are increasing and have increased since, mid 2012, 2013, we started seeing this sharp increase. So one of the things that I think is important to think about is, what can employers in workplaces do to address this? And one of the things that I've worked most closely with is domestic violence policy, sexual violence, stalking. So how do we create a workplace like the story you gave right away, that you were a coworker of someone who suddenly her personal relationship that was abusive and not safe came into your workspace and her workspace. So the domestic violence advocacy, movement has been doing a lot of work on policy, on engaging workplaces and creating really specific policy. So that's really like the first step, is putting on paper that you have a workplace policy that addresses harassment in the workplace, intimate partner violence in the workplace. And what that can include in that policy is a comprehensive education and training program to prevent violence. And that could look like healthy relationship education programming. That can look like working on your reporting process. So a reporting process should be encouraged. Management and leaders should talk about the reporting process. Oftentimes where people go wrong is there will be a policy, but the communication about the policy is unclear. It is vague. It is sort of veiled. So there's got to be transparency. So you have to encourage reporting, because we know that approximately 2 million people file a report each year of some kind of violent act in the workplace. But that 2 million is a conservative estimate because a lot of people don't report. And when you ask people why they don't report, they say they don't know how to do it. So there's got to be transparency on how to make a report about a violent incident. And then also the reporting process itself. You have to look at what that looks like. Is it a safe process? Is there any fear of retribution if it is worker to worker? And you have to really think about policy isn't just enough. You've got to create good, transparent, safe policy. And also with domestic and sexual violence and stalking, you've got to work with people on a safety plan. Safety planning was sort of one of the main activities that, say, a domestic violence agency will work with a survivor is say, okay, when and if something happens, we have to have a plan in place. So employers can work with employees who are in a domestic abuse situation and can say, here is our safety plan. What does a safety plan look like? It can look like changing your employee's work schedule. If he or she or they need to come in earlier and not work later because they're afraid of what's going to happen at night, because maybe their significant other drinks at night and they're afraid that they're going to come get them at night. So a change in work schedule. You can also let security know if there is security detail at your workplace. You can let them know. You can have a list and a contact name. This can all be a part of a safety plan. I have some other things I jotted down because I don't want to forget. Also changing where they park, if whatever helps them feel safe, coming up with a way that you as a workplace can ensure and try to mitigate the risk to their harm. And also, this is really important, is we know that survivors of domestic violence take financial hits because they have to take days out of work. So part of your workplace policy can say, if you are the victim of domestic abuse, we will not fire you on those grounds alone. And we will work with you. We will make sure that you do not experience any sort of adverse job outcomes because you are a victim of domestic violence. And so these are some of the things that employers can do to work with people. So that's like policy level, workplace level. I know, Kendra, you had mentioned also wanting to eventually talk about workplace culture. Yeah,
I was thinking in those examples, a huge part of what Kris is laying out is also, not stigmatizing the victims of domestic violence. So of course, some people, especially women who are more often the victims, but not the only victims of domestic violence, they don't want to disclose this information to managers because they fear, repercussion. They fear that, oh, they're going to think that I'm not coming into work, or, all of these these ideas that have in their head that will prevent them. But if, as Kris suggests, the workplace has a culture, it has a policy that those victims of domestic violence or people engaged in domestic violence relationships are not stigmatized, and that open line of communication is so important. I mean, you can think back to your own work experience when you got hired. You went through orientation and onboarding. Did they talk about harassment? Did they talk about a policy about workplace violence? Did they talk about safety protocols in the case of workplace violence? Did they talk about a safety plan? If they did not, these are missing elements that are core and foundational to your workplace, not just because there is a unprecedented uprise in the amount of mass shootings and just violence across the board, as Kris was saying, but there's just a general sense of safety that you would need to know. So another thing, other than, Kris said a lot about establishing these anti-violence policies and these anti-harassment policies, and really attaching the sanctions and the repercussions to people who violate those, and having a clear line of communication for those who want to file. Another really key thing is to help your workers, your workplace understand and celebrate difference. It just seems like a small thing, but a lot of times people lash out when they're angry or upset, and the perpetrators, they lash out at people who are different from them, even if they're coworkers and they've been friends or, you know, colleagues for so long. Or it could be the case that they don't like a particular group or like, you know, like a particular type of person. So training, education, and awareness on difference and how you celebrate difference in your workplace also leads to, number one, of course, education, but two, if you just really have a person who's just racist, sexist, you know, homophobic, whatever the issue is that they have, they understand upfront, this is not a place where they're going to feel comfortable, because their fears, or, you know, their perception of fears is not going to be, you know, fostered in that environment, and they need to find another workplace. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, and I think so much of that, Kendra, is about like having really good leadership who is going to take that on, right? And create an environment that is supportive and healthy, where everyone feels like they're safe and dignified at work and valued at work. And that is not necessarily a skill set every manager or employer or leader has. And that's why it can be really helpful to bring in outsiders to do some of that diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and find blind spots. Because you may think, if you don't have a transparent reporting process, if people feel like, you know, snitching, right? If it's framed as snitching there, that's a part of a culture. Like if that's how people see it and it's not seen as reporting, if that's how people phrase it, then it could be not a process people want to engage in. So you can bring people in and to kind of find those spots. Because I think oftentimes people can be surprised about harassment that's taking place in the workplace, because it happens. There's a culture of silence in general with things like sexual harassment in our culture. And people might not want to speak up if we think about race-based harassment or sexual harassment, because they're afraid that they're going to lose their job. They're going to be that squeaky wheel. They're going to be seen as whining and complaining. And we know that when women are in male-dominated workplaces, the sexual harassment is highest in those kind of contexts where they're seen as posing some kind of threat. So it's really about leadership, taking this on and verbalizing that this is not the kind of team or department or crew, right, that is going to tolerate any sort of language, behavior for people to feel unsafe. And sometimes that means you got to bring other people in to it as well. So that's why I think consultants like Work for Change can be good to also do assessments and work with you and help you kind of find those blind spots. Yeah. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say just really quickly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes, you know, stats on this every year. And it has been found that homicide is actually the number 2 leading cause of death in the workplace, and that women are overwhelmingly the victims of workplace violence. And so, like Kris was saying, all workplaces really need to be really considerate of all of these things. If you want to protect the safety, and if you care about the well-being of all of your workers, management, and understand how management plays a role. And so with Work for Change, the consultancy that Kris and I run, we come in and, you know, we often talk on our podcast about diversity and race relations and things, because, you know, that's, if you will, what's in the news and what's really being pushed. But we really wanted to broaden the conversation to say that we also can help you very well with some foundational strategies, thought processes on how to address and better prepare your entire workforce for safety, preventing workplace violence, and anti-harassment. So you can find us at change llc.com, workforchangellc.com. We're on all social media platforms, which is, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course you found us here on YouTube. So please like, subscribe, and share so we can work to make the world of work better.